Hey everybody, welcome back to the Formly channel, where we make medical device regulations easier to understand. Today we're talking about risk management. So why did you click on this video? Probably because you have to do risk management for your company or for your medical device, or you love just taking risks. In this video, I'm going to talk about the basics of risk management, how to do it for your medical device, and how startups can have good risk management procedures in their company. Let's get into it. All right, so what is risk management? Risk management is an approach to building safe products. They use it for medical devices, we use it for planes, we use it for automobiles, and the idea behind it is really just predicting all the potential risks and everything that could go wrong with your product before you even put it on the market. For medical devices, we have a risk management file. So what is a risk management file? That is a plan, an assessment, and a report. So your risk management plan lays out all the procedures you're going to use for your risk assessment and continuing to evaluate risks. Your risk analysis is the actual analysis of the risks. So that's actually looking at the probability and severity of things going wrong with your product. And the risk management report is a summary of everything that you did. And that's kind of tying the knot on your whole risk management file before you submit it. So there is a standard for risk management, of course. It is ISO 14971. We always recommend that you buy the standard just so you have a reference when you're putting together all your files. There's also a standard on how to implement risk management processes according to ISO 14971. That's called ISO TR 24971. Yeah, there's a standard for the standard. It's kind of ridiculous, but it has some good tips in there on how to do risk management, how to do different risk analyses and things like that. Now, let's talk about the risk assessment process. So typically there's two main ways to do a risk assessment. One is called a preliminary hazard analysis, that's a PHA, and the other is a failure modes effect analysis, or an FMEA. And so these are the two main ways to do them. I'm going to talk about the PHA today because it tends to be more simple and it tends to be all you need for more low risk devices, but FMEAs are really helpful once you get into the higher risk classes. These two types of risk analyses are called top down or bottom up. Kind of sounds like a rap song. Essentially, top down is the PHA. That's essentially saying we have a finished product. Let's think of all the foreseeable risks that can happen with our finished product. And the bottom up is the FMEA. The way that works is essentially you break apart every component of the device and think about what could go wrong with each component. And from there, you get all your risks and potential hazards for your users. So one of the main purposes of the risk management standard, ISO 14971, is to reduce risk as far as possible. Some people abbreviate this to AFAP. So the way that people typically do a risk assessment is by assigning the risks two things, a probability and a severity. We also create a risk matrix, and it's essentially a table. On one axis is probability, on the other axis is severity. And we essentially assign acceptable or unacceptable into each cell of the table. Then we use this risk matrix table to figure out if our risks are acceptable or unacceptable. I'll show you what this looks like in a minute. First, let's talk about risks. What do they actually look like? What is a risk? So typically people break down risks into three things: a hazard, a hazardous situation, and a harm. A hazard is something that could potentially go wrong with a device. So let's take an example device, for instance. Let's say we have a glucose monitor. The hazard could be that the glucose data doesn't load for the user. Now, let's talk about a hazardous situation. A hazardous situation results from a hazard, and essentially it's a situation that could cause harm to a user. So for our glucose monitor, we said that the hazard is that the glucose data doesn't load. So the hazardous situation could be that the user's glucose is too low and they don't know it. So let's talk about harm then. Harm is a situation where the user can actually be injured. So let's take our hazardous situation, for example. The glucose is too low for our user and they don't know it. A harm that can result from that is they could go into diabetic shock. And so this is a situation that the user actually gets injured. So for harms, you typically assign a severity. This is going to tell us, okay, is this harm just like a scratch on the arm? Or is it potentially something life-threatening, like them going into a coma and maybe even dying? For each of the hazardous situations, and harms, you have probabilities of one leading to the next. And then you get a final probability. And that final probability is what you compare to that severity of the harm to figure out if your risk is acceptable or unacceptable. All right, we're on my desktop now because I wanted to show you how to do a risk matrix in our Formly software. So essentially, our software has some of your product information in it already. It'll ask you a few questions and then it'll build a matrix for you, which is really cool. So when you're in our software, you'll always get a suggestion on what the answer should be. And this is based on product information that we have already gathered about what your device actually does. So we'll see, it's going to ask us how often will our device be used, and it suggests that we use it daily, and it'll have a lifetime use of multiple years. It's also going to ask us to classify the health risk of our intended users, and the idea here is understanding which risk could be acceptable. So high-risk devices, there may be hospitalization as an acceptable risk, but that's not for low-risk devices. So for here, we see that we actually have a low-risk device, so minor injury would be considered a significant risk. So we'll choose that one. And boom, it creates the risk matrix table right here for you. You can see across the top, we have our severities, and across the left, we have our probabilities of occurrence. And so in each one of these cells, we have acceptable, reduced risk as far as possible, or unacceptable. And this is what we're going to use to categorize our risks once we do our risk analysis. So if it's in the acceptable range, let's say it's a P2 S1, then it's an acceptable risk and we don't really need to reduce risk on it at all. If it's a unacceptable risk, let's say that it's an occasional risk that could potentially lead to death, so it's catastrophic or fatal, that's an unacceptable risk, and we're going to have to build in some risk controls. So that's what the Formly software does. It'll create a risk matrix for you, which saves you a ton of time. The other thing I wanted to show you was a risk assessment, and what the actual risk analysis table typically looks like for a preliminary hazard analysis, or a PHA. So this is what the table typically looks like. You'll see that we have hazards, hazardous situations, and harms. We have probabilities of one leading to the other, which is really nice. And then we have our combined probability here in the P1 times P2 column. We'll see that we have a probability and a severity column here. That's where our ranking of P1, P2, P3, S1, S2, S3, those fit in here. And this combination of these two tell us where this risk sits on that risk matrix we just created. So if it's in an acceptable place on our risk matrix, this will be a yes. If it's unacceptable or reduced risk as far as possible, this will be a no. And a great thing about the Formly software is you can regenerate this table and it'll create brand new risks for you each time. And so it'll essentially stream in the answers of the predicted risks or foreseeable risks for your product based on the information that you've already provided us, and it'll give this risk acceptability based on the risk matrix that you created. So it saves you a ton of time. You don't have to sit looking at a blank template, and it's all organized in the right way in a table that auditors are expecting to see it. So we just talked about how to do our risk assessment. So this would go in our risk analysis for the risk management file. Let's talk about risk controls and your final risk evaluation that you get after the risk analysis. So what are risk controls? Risk controls come up when you have unacceptable risks. Let's say you're at a construction site. There is a risk that something might fall on your head. A risk control would essentially be like wearing a hard hat in that situation. Risk controls for medical devices come in three flavors. They are inherently safe design, protective measures, and then information for safety. Safe design essentially means we're going to design the medical device just to be safer. So we're just going to implement some design changes and that risk will be mitigated, essentially. Protective measures is like our hard hat example. We're essentially going to build in other measures into the software that are going to help reduce the risk. This could be sending messages to people, or let's say if something's going to overheat on your device, you put a protective layer around it, things like that. Information for safety is essentially adding in some more information to, let's say, your instructions for use or your device label that tells the user that there are potential risks with using the device, so they're prepared when they start using it. So what happens to these risk controls? They end up as product requirements in your medical device, so you end up building a product that you know is safe. So once you finish your risk analysis, essentially you're going to have leftover risk. This is called residual risk. Then you're going to do what's called a benefit risk analysis. And that essentially says, okay, do the benefits of what my product offers people outweigh any of the leftover risks that are still there after my risk controls? Let's say, for example, the benefits of your made-up device are that it could save someone's life, but they might end up in the hospital for 2 weeks. That's probably okay. Let's take another example. Let's say that your made-up device improves people's visions to 20/20, but it also chops their nose off in the process. Probably not okay for most people. So that's what your benefit risk profile is. Once you know that your benefit risk profile is good, that's pretty much the end of your risk analysis. You've looked at all your risks, you've looked at all your benefits to your product, you know that you're in the green. Now let's talk about risk management review and what happens in the post-market. Your risk management review is your risk management report. It's essentially a report that summarizes everything that you just did for your risk management. So it's fairly simple, it's a summary, and you just have to have it for your medical device before it can be on the market. So let's say you finished your whole risk management file, you got your CE mark, your product's on the market, you're done, right? Wrong. Post-market, you have to keep an eye on complaints and make sure that your product actually is doing what you said it was going to do and is causing the same risk that you thought it would. So if things are different in the post-market, and let's say you only thought it was going to be causing someone a minor scratch, and it's causing them to lose their leg, you might need to update your risk management. So in the biz, we say that risk management is alive. It's alive, it's alive! It's a live document, you're constantly updating it, and that's because you're constantly getting feedback about your product in the market. And that's why we call them foreseeable risks, because they're the best guess at what we think the product's gonna do when it's in the market. So we have to update it down the road, and we'll essentially do a new risk analysis with any new risks that we get, do our risk controls, do our final benefit risk profile again, and then do our report again. It's that easy. So that's it. That's risk management basics for you. That's the whole process for a preliminary hazard analysis and what to do when your product's actually on the market. I'll cover FMEAs and some more serious risk assessment procedures in a later video, but that's what most low-risk device companies need to have. So if that video was helpful for you at all, please do us a favor, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.